The silks felt like a shroud, beautiful and suffocating. Arya adjusted the pale gray fabric, her fingers trembling slightly. Every Omega servant was dressed in the same muted color for the royal gathering. Because of that, they were meant to be invisible, part of the castle's decor, silent and unobtrusive. But deep down, she knew the truth. They were not invisible. They were targets. "Keep your head down, Arya." The whisper came from Lyra, another Omega, her eyes wide with a fear that mirrored Arya's own. Lyra was older, her spirit worn down to a nub by years of service, and her warnings were never idle. "Especially around Lord Vorlag and his warriors," Lyra added, her voice barely a breath. "They're restless tonight. I can smell the bloodlust on them." Arya swallowed, the sound loud in her own ears. "I will." To make things worse, her memory chose that moment to betray her, dragging her back to a year ago. A dropped platter, a splash of wine on a lesser lord's boot. She remembered the sting of the thin silver rod against her back, not in anger, but with a cold, terrifying indifference. The lord hadn't even looked at her as he'd delivered the punishment, as if she were a piece of furniture he was straightening. That's why she learned that pain was not the worst part. It was the feeling of being nothing, an object. Maybe it was fate that she had to face this again. "Just get through the night," Lyra murmured, giving her arm a quick, desperate squeeze before melting back into the shadows of the servants' corridor. "Just survive." But as Arya took a deep, steadying breath and stepped through the archway into the blinding light and overwhelming noise of the grand hall, a question she couldn't answer haunted her. Was survival just a slower way to die? Her goal was simple: invisibility. She moved along the edges of the room, a ghost in gray silk, her eyes fixed on the marble floor. Her tray of filled wine goblets felt impossibly heavy. The air was thick with the sense of power, of alpha aggression and expensive perfume, and it made her own sweet Omega scent feel like a liability, a drop of blood in piranha-infested waters. She refilled the glass of a laughing beta lord, her movements fluid and practiced, her face a perfect mask of subservience. She could feel their eyes on her, on all the Omegas, their gazes like physical, groping hands. She didn't know what scared her more, the open contempt or the predatory hunger that lay just beneath it. With every heartbeat, the weight of their stares grew heavier, and the cavernous hall, with its glittering chandeliers and soaring ceilings, began to feel like a cage. A very beautiful, very deadly cage. All she had to do was remain unseen, unheard, and untouched, a simple task that felt as monumental as moving a mountain. Before she could move, a heavy hand clamped down on her shoulder, and her world, it stopped.
From the shadows of his throne, King Aldrich watched the endless sea of smiling sharks that was his court. He despised these gatherings. They were a necessary performance, a display of power and stability, but the falseness of it all grated on his soul. The weight of the Iron Crown was a constant, cold reminder of his duty, a duty forged in the fires of betrayal. "Your Majesty," Lord Aemon, a portly beta with shifty eyes, bowed low. "The harvest reports are even better than we'd hoped. Your strategies have once again proven flawless." Aldrich let the silence stretch, watching the Lord begin to sweat. "The strategies were my father's, Aemon," he said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the nearby chatter. "I merely had the will to enforce them." The unspoken message hung in the air, unlike him. Aemon paled and bowed again, scurrying away like the rat he was. Aldrich's gaze swept the room, cold and assessing. He was a ruthless king, feared by all, and he had cultivated that fear meticulously. He had to, because his father, a kind and merciful alpha, was dead. He remembered it with a clarity that time could not dull, the scent of betrayal sharp in the air, the sight of his father's blood on the white marble of this very hall, and the chilling realization that mercy was a luxury a king could not afford. Love was a weakness. Vulnerability was a death sentence. In fact, he had built his entire reign on that single brutal truth. But then, something cut through the cloying perfume and the stink of ambition. A scent. It was impossible. A scent of wild lavender after a storm, and the impossible sweetness of winter moonlight. It was a scent he had only ever dreamed of, a scent his own soul recognized with a primal, earth-shattering certainty. His wolf, a beast he kept caged and controlled behind an iron will, surged against its bars, a silent roar echoing in the cage of his ribs. Mate. His eyes, the color of molten gold, narrowed, scanning the crowd. The hunt was on. He dismissed courtiers with a clipped word, his entire being focused on that single intoxicating thread of scent. He followed it through the throng of bodies, a predator moving unseen through a herd of oblivious prey. Where was she? Where? He found her. She was small, dressed in the gray of the servants, her head bowed as she offered wine to a lord. The scent was pouring off her, a beacon in the darkness of his world. And in that moment, as if fate demanded it, the two most significant events of his life collided with catastrophic force. He found his mate just in time to watch her torment begin.
For Aldrich, the world narrowed to a single point of focus. He saw Lord Vorlag, his top warrior and a brute of an alpha, swagger toward her. He saw the cruel, indulgent smiles on the faces of the men with him. They cornered her against a pillar, their large bodies boxing her in, and the scent of her fear, a sharp, panicked note beneath the lavender, lanced through him like a spear. For Arya, the world had shrunk to a circle of leering faces. Vorlag. His name was a curse in the servants' quarters. He was known for his cruelty, and now his predatory gaze was fixed on her. Well, well, Vorlag's voice was a low, mocking drawl. Look what we have here. A pretty little Omega all by herself. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Don't speak, don't look at him, don't exist. What's the matter, little mouse? Another warrior taunted. Cat got your tongue? Vorlag chuckled, a horrible, grating sound. She is a servant. She has no tongue, only uses. And right now? He took a full goblet of deep red wine from a nearby table. I think this vintage would look better on her than in a glass. Before the words left her lips, before she could even process the intent, he tilted his hand. The wine wasn't just poured, it was a deluge. A cold, shocking river of red that cascaded down her hair, over her face, and soaked the front of her simple gray dress, turning it a deep, bruised purple. It clung to her skin, cold and sticky. Gasps rippled through the nearby crowd, followed by a wave of cruel, rolling laughter. The warriors with Vorlag howled, slapping their thighs. The shame was a physical thing, a hot, searing brand against her skin that was 1,000 times worse than the cold of the wine. Her world tilted, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall. Her gaze, terrified and shimmering with unshed tears, flew across the hall in a desperate search for, she didn't know what, an escape, a shadow to hide in, and slammed into his. The king. He was on his throne, half hidden in the shadows, but there was no mistaking him. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't even moving. He was just watching. His golden eyes were fixed on her, and their intensity was more terrifying than all the laughter in the world. In that moment, something inside Aldrich shifted. It wasn't the hot, explosive rage of his wolf. No, it was something colder, something quieter, something absolute. He saw the fear in her eyes. He saw the casual cruelty in theirs. He saw the end of their lives, though they didn't know it yet. His beast didn't want to rage. It wanted to hunt, one by one. He catalogued their faces, burning their laughing features into his memory. Vorlag, Kaelin, Rorik, all of them. The moment their eyes locked, the world fell away. There was only the humiliated girl and the silent, watching king. The laughter faded into a dull roar in the background. Then, she broke the contact, her spirit finally shattering. She dropped what was left on her tray with a clatter and fled, a ghost in a wine-stained dress. Aldrich, the Alpha King, did not move a muscle. He simply sat on his throne of iron and shadow, the golden fire in his eyes banking to a low, patient, and murderous glow. They would all pay. Back in the dim light of the servants' quarters, the shame clung to her worse than the sticky wine. Arya shivered not from the cold, but from the bone-deep humiliation that felt like a permanent stain on her soul. She scrubbed at the purple splotch on her gray dress with a damp rag, but the fabric was ruined, a dark, ugly mark that mirrored the one on her spirit. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't wash away the memory of their laughter, or the terrifying intensity of the king's golden eyes. Deep down, she knew the truth. She was marked now, and not in a good way. Without warning, the chatter and nervous energy of the other servants in the corridor died. A thick, heavy silence fell, the kind that precedes something terrible. Her breath caught. The sound of heavy, rhythmic footsteps approached, 2 sets of them, methodical and unstoppable. Her heart skipped. The door creaked open. 2 of them. Royal guards, their armor gleaming dully in the low light, their faces like masks carved from stone. They didn't look at the other Omegas who flattened themselves against the walls. Their eyes found her, and only her. "Arya," the first guard said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "By order of the king, you are to come with us." A cold dread washed over her, so absolute it stole the strength from her limbs. This was it, the execution. She must have offended him somehow by her display of weakness, by drawing the attention of his lords, by simply existing in his line of sight. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't do anything." The guards didn't answer. They simply stood there, waiting, their presence an undeniable command. There was no room for argument, no space for mercy. As if pulled by a string, her body moved on instinct, her legs carrying her forward on numb feet. The other Omegas watched, their faces pale with a mixture of pity and terror, but none dared to move, none dared to speak. Because of that, she had never felt more alone. They marched her from the warmth and familiar smells of the servants' quarters and into the grand, cold corridors of the palace proper. Her mind spun. She saw the silver rod from her memory. She saw a dark, windowless cell. She saw an axe. But the path they took was not down, towards the dungeons. Instead, they went up, towards the king's private wing. And she didn't know what scared her more, the death she had expected, or the terrifying mystery that now awaited her.
From his vantage point on a dark stone balcony overlooking the main hall, Aldrich watched them escort her away. He saw the terror in the stiff set of her shoulders, the way her head was bowed in absolute surrender. The scent of her fear was a physical torment, 1,000 tiny needles prickling at his skin and his wolf. His wolf was a raging inferno, clawing at the bars of his control, demanding he go to her, wrap himself around her, and tear apart anything that had made her feel this way. But he held it back. He had to, because he knew the truth of his court. They were sharks, and the scent of a king's weakness was blood in the water. To show his hand now, to reveal his interest in this small, terrified Omega, would be to paint a target on her back so large that even he might not be able to protect her from it. So, he stood still, a statue carved from shadow and fury, and let her be afraid of him. It was a bitter, iron-laced pill, but it was necessary. "Garrus," he said, not turning as his most trusted commander appeared at his side. "Your Majesty." Garrus was an old alpha, his face a roadmap of scars from 100 battles, his loyalty absolute. "You saw the girl," Aldrich stated. "It wasn't a question. I did." "She is to be taken to the Shadow Wing," he commanded, his voice low and hard as granite. "The old Queen's suites. You will post a permanent rotating guard. No one gets in. And more importantly, she does not get out." Garrus's weathered face showed a flicker of surprise. "The Shadow Wing, my king? It has been sealed for a generation." "Then unseal it," Aldrich growled. She is to have every comfort, the finest foods, the softest silks, any book she desires, but she is to see no one. Do you understand? And if she asks why? In that moment, Aldrich let his gaze drift back to the hall, to the knot of laughing, arrogant warriors led by Lord Vorlag. A cold, predatory smile touched his lips. "Tell her she is my guest," he said, the words dripping with unspoken threat. "Tell her the king has taken a special interest in her well-being," which meant her tormentors would soon learn the true meaning of the king's special interest. As Garrus bowed and departed to carry out the orders, Aldrich remained on the balcony. He pulled a small, folded piece of parchment from his tunic. On it, in his own sharp, precise script, were 3 names: Vorlag, Kalen, Rorik. As the silence stretched, he stared at the names, a silent promise echoing in the chambers of his cold, vengeful heart. The hunt had begun, and he would enjoy every single moment of it.
The doors were massive, carved from a dark ancient wood and inlaid with faded silver. They groaned open, revealing a sight that made Arya's breath hitch in her throat. This wasn't a cell. It was a fairy tale. A thick layer of dust covered everything, sparkling like diamond powder in the single beam of moonlight that pierced the gloom from a tall, arched window. The air smelled of old roses, of beeswax, and of time itself. It was a suite of rooms, larger than the entire servants' wing, filled with furniture shrouded in white cloths, their shapes like sleeping ghosts. Moments later, an elderly woman with a face like a dried apple and a spine of pure iron appeared, carrying a single flickering candle. "I am Morwen," she announced, her voice raspy with disuse. "I am to be your attendant." Arya just stared, her mind unable to process the shift from expecting death to this. Morwen's sharp eyes took in her wine-stained dress with a flicker of distaste. "By order of the king, these are your chambers. This is your new home." The words made no sense. "My home?" "You will be provided with anything you require," Morwen continued, ignoring her question. "But you are not to leave the Shadow Wing." The contradiction was a physical blow. She was not a prisoner, but she was not free. She was not a guest, but she was no longer a servant. She was nothing. An object moved from one box to another. By the time Morwen had laid out a simple, beautiful nightgown of the softest white cotton, Arya was numb. The old woman took her stained gray dress, and with it, the last piece of Arya's old life, the life she understood. "Why?" Arya finally managed to ask, her voice a fragile whisper in the vast, silent room. "Why am I here?" Morwen paused at the door, her hand on the iron latch. For the first time, a flicker of something other than stern duty crossed her face. Pity, perhaps. "Truth be told, girl, some questions are more dangerous than their answers. Best you don't ask." The door clicked shut, leaving Arya alone in the ghostly, beautiful prison. In the quiet that followed, she drifted towards a tall, dust-filmed mirror. She saw a girl with wide, terrified eyes, swallowed by a room of forgotten grandeur. She was safe. She was warm. She was surrounded by a luxury she couldn't have even imagined, and she was utterly, completely trapped. Her thoughts spun. As the echo of the closing door faded, a single, hot tear escaped and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. It was followed by another. Her chest ached. She pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle the sound as her body was racked by a single, silent, terrified sob. Days bled into one another, each one a soft, silent echo of the last. At first, the terror was a living thing, a shadow that clung to her in the vast, dusty suite. She would jump at the creak of a floorboard, at the whisper of the wind against the ancient glass. She was a prisoner, she knew it. Because of that, she expected cruelty, a punishment that was simply waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. But the cruelty never came. Instead, there was food. Trays of warm bread, sweet jams, and roasted meats left silently outside her door. There were dresses of soft wool and even softer silk, laid out by the stern but ever-present Morwen. And there was the shadow wing itself. With every heartbeat, a sliver of courage returned. As if pulled by a string, her body moved on instinct, carrying her out of the main bedchamber. She explored. Her fingers traced the spines of forgotten books in a library whose air was thick with the sweet, dry scent of paper and time. She found a small circular room at the top of a winding stair, its walls all glass, a forgotten conservatory where dead vines still clung to the panes like skeletal fingers. It was a beautiful prison, a gilded cage. But the silence? The silence was the real jailer. It was absolute, a crushing weight that left her with nothing but the frantic, spinning wheel of her own thoughts. Why was she here? Was this some sort of game? A way to torment her before the end? To make things worse, her only contact with the outside world was the muffled, indistinct murmur of the guards outside her main door. Moments later, one of those murmurs sharpened. She pressed her ear to the heavy wood, her breath held tight in her chest. "Fell on his own blade," a gruff voice was saying. "During a training spar, a fatal accident." "An accident?" A second voice scoffed, lower and more skeptical. "With Kalen? He was one of Vorlag's best. And the second one this week to have an accident." "Orders are orders," the first voice grumbled. "And our orders are to watch the girl. The king's business is his own." The voices faded, and Arya pulled back from the door, a cold knot forming in her stomach. Kalen. The name was familiar. He was one of them. One of the warriors who had laughed. An accident. Her thoughts spun. What did it mean? What was happening outside the walls of her silent world? She wrapped her arms around herself, the soft wool of her new dress doing little to ward off the sudden, icy chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. A chill that came from a dawning, terrifying suspicion.
The report lay on the polished wood of his desk. Kalen, son of Lord Tyrell, deceased. A tragic but not entirely uncommon training accident. The official story was flawless. Aldrich tossed the parchment into the fire, watching the edges curl and blacken before catching flame. A cold, clean satisfaction settled in his bones. That was two. One remained. Vorlag. He was saving him for last. In fact, the anticipation of that final, personal revenge was a pleasure he intended to savor. But as the echo of his victory faded, a different, more frustrating ache took its place. The scent of his mate. It was a constant presence, a phantom limb he could feel even from across the castle. It called to his wolf, a sweet, agonizing song of lavender and moonlight that made the gilded halls of his palace feel like a cage. Without thinking, his body moved, carrying him towards the shadow wing. He had to see her. He needed to know if the terror had lessened, if the comforts he had provided had soothed the wounded spirit he'd seen in her eyes. Because, truth be told, he had conquered armies with less thought than he'd given to the thread count of her bedsheets. He found her on a small stone balcony overlooking a forgotten, overgrown garden. The moonlight caught in her dark hair, turning it to silver. She was so small, so fragile-looking, and the sight of her sent a possessive, protective growl rumbling through his chest. "The air is cool tonight," he said. His voice, meant to be gentle, came out like grinding stones. She flinched violently, whirling around, her eyes wide with the familiar, gut-wrenching terror he was beginning to hate more than anything in the world. "Your Majesty," she whispered, dropping into a deep curtsy. As the silence stretched, he struggled for words. What was he supposed to say? How did one speak to the other half of their soul when they looked at you as if you were an executioner? "Are you comfortable?" he asked, the word feeling clumsy and foreign on his tongue. She nodded jerkily, her eyes fixed on the stone floor. "Yes, Your Majesty. Thank you, Your Majesty." Frustration, hot and sharp, pricked at him. "Look at me." Her head snapped up, her eyes shimmering with fear, and in that moment he knew he had failed. He was the king. He was the monster. He had taken her from her world, locked her away, and now demanded she not be afraid of the very power that held her captive. Instead of soothing her, he had only reminded her of the bars of her cage. Without another word, he turned and stalked away, the scent of her fear following him like a personal demon. As he stormed through the empty corridors, a vow solidified in his heart, hard and sharp as a diamond. He would find a way to reach her. He would tear down the wall of fear between them, brick by bloody brick if he had to. He just had to get rid of the men who had built it first.
Lord Vorlag stood before the throne, his face a mask of polite concern that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Two of my finest warriors, Your Majesty," he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "Dead in a week. These accidents are becoming a concern for morale." Aldrich leaned back in his throne, steepling his fingers. He let his gaze drift over Vorlag, a predator idly observing its prey. "Training is a dangerous necessity, my lord. The weak are culled. The strong survive. This is the way of our world, a way you have always championed." Vorlag's jaw tightened. "Of course, but the timing is curious. It coincides with the disappearance of a certain Omega servant, one my men had a brief interaction with at the gathering." The air in the throne room thickened, becoming heavy and charged. Aldrich's smile was a chilling, razor-thin line. "Are you implying a connection, Lord Vorlag? Between the necessary culling of your ranks and a low-born servant I wouldn't recognize if she were standing before me now?" It was a lie, a beautiful, perfect lie, and they both knew it. Vorlag was testing him. He was fishing in dangerous waters. "I imply nothing, my king," Vorlag said, bowing low. "I am merely an observer of curious events." "Then I suggest you observe more carefully from a distance," Aldrich purred, dismissing him with a flick of his wrist. "Before your curiosity becomes a fatal accident." Vorlag paled, bowed again, and retreated, the scent of his barely contained fury a foul stench in the air. Meanwhile, in the shadow wing, Arya had found a small indulgence. The attendants, following Morwen's lead, had started speaking more freely around her, assuming she was just a piece of the furniture. They gossiped as they delivered her food, their voices hushed but clear in the echoing silence. "Lord Vorlag was with the king all morning," one whispered. "Arguing about that warrior who died," the other added. "The one they're all talking about. Kaelin." Arya froze, a piece of bread halfway to her lips. "The same one who poured wine on that poor girl at the gathering?" the first attendant said with a sniff of disapproval. "Serves him right, if you ask me. They say he was always a cruel one." "The one who poured wine on that poor girl." Her world tilted. The dead warrior, the wine, the king's cold, golden eyes watching her from the shadows, the whispers of the guards, the king's visit, her imprisonment in this beautiful cage. It wasn't random. None of it. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. A horrifying, impossible truth slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. The accidents, the deaths, they weren't accidents at all. They were messages. They were vengeance. And she, a nameless, worthless Omega, was the cause. The king, the most feared and ruthless wolf in the kingdom, was killing for her.
Aldrich stood before the assembled warrior caste in the training grounds, the morning air crisp and cold. The third name on his list, Rorik, stood in the center of the ring, proud and arrogant. But this time, there would be no convenient accident. This one needed to be a lesson. "Rorik of Stonefall." Aldrich's voice was deceptively calm, yet it carried across the yard, silencing all chatter. "You are accused of cowardice during the Eastern Ridge skirmish last winter, of abandoning your post and allowing 2 of your pack brothers to fall." A gasp rippled through the warriors. This was an old charge, one that had been quietly dismissed. Rorik paled. "Your Majesty, I was cleared." "I have reviewed the testimony." Aldrich cut him off, his voice dropping, becoming a low, dangerous growl. "And I have found it lacking." He produced a new scroll, the king's seal gleaming in the sun. "I have a new testimony, from a scout who was too afraid of your influence to speak then, but found his courage when his king asked for the truth." It was a lie, of course. The scout was a fiction, the testimony a fabrication. But it was a perfect one. Without another word, Aldrich stripped Rorik of his rank, his lands, and his name, banishing him to the northern wastes as a nameless Omega-class exile. He didn't just kill the man, he erased him. And he did it publicly, using the flawless letter of pack law to mask the icy personal vengeance that drove him. The court was now buzzing, not just with fear, but with a deep, unsettling paranoia. No one felt safe. As a result, his power was more absolute than ever. Still, the victory felt hollow. That night he returned to his chambers, the silence a suffocating companion. His crown sat heavy on a stand, and the scent of lavender and moonlight from the sealed wing of the castle was a constant, maddening ache. He had absolute power over his kingdom, yet he couldn't command the fear from the eyes of one small Omega. He had orchestrated the fall of powerful warriors with a word, but he didn't have the first clue how to earn her trust. And that, he was beginning to realize, was a battle he was terrified to lose.
The knowledge was a poison. Every meal she ate, every book she opened, every moment of peace was tainted by the horrifying truth. Men were dying because of her. The king was a monster, but he was her monster. And that thought was a dizzying, terrifying spiral she couldn't escape. She had to stop him. That night, she found him in the vast, moonlit library of the Shadow Wing. He stood before a towering shelf, his back to her, but she knew he was aware of her presence. The air thickened, buzzing with a tension that was more than just fear. It was something else. Something ancient and electric. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice trembling but clear. "You must stop." He turned slowly. His golden eyes burned into her, not with anger, but with a raw, savage frustration. "Stop what? Protecting you?" "This isn't protection," she cried, taking a small, brave step forward. This is murder. You are killing them because of me, and you are putting a target on my back. Everyone will hate me. They will see me as a curse." "Let them," he growled, stalking towards her. "Let them hate you. Let them fear you. It is better than what they did to you." "No," she insisted, her desperation making her bold. "It's not. I don't want this. Why are you doing this? I am a servant, an Omega. I am nothing. Why does a girl like me matter so much to a king like you?" The question hung in the air between them, shimmering with all her fear and confusion. For a moment, she thought he might strike her. His face was a mask of torment, a battle raging behind his eyes. "Because you are not nothing," he finally rasped, his voice ragged with an emotion she couldn't name. "You have never been nothing." Before she could move, he closed the distance between them. His hand, large and calloused, shot out, not to strike, but to gently, desperately, cup her jaw. As if the world narrowed, he lowered his head, his forehead resting against hers. His other hand found hers, his fingers lacing through her own. The moment their skin touched, a jolt, a bolt of pure, white-hot lightning shot through her. It was a shock of recognition so profound, so deep in her bones that her knees buckled. Her wolf, a creature she had always thought of as a small, timid thing, rose up inside her, not in fear, but with a howl of pure, unadulterated joy. Of homecoming. "Why?" he whispered, his breath warm against her lips, his golden eyes filled with a century of longing. "Because the scent of your soul is the only thing my own has ever searched for." As fire bloomed beneath her skin, he spoke the words that shattered her world and rebuilt it in a single, earth-shaking heartbeat. "You are mine, Arya. You are my mate." Her breath caught. The word hung in the air, filled with impossible power. Mate. It was a fairy tale, a myth whispered among Omegas, a bond of fated souls, a connection stronger than life. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. but as she stared into the depths of his golden eyes, she felt it, etched in fire. Her soul answered his, and she didn't pull her hand away.
For the first time since she had arrived, the terror in her eyes was gone. It had been replaced by a stunned, wide-eyed wonder. That single change was a greater victory than the fall of 100 enemies. A fragile, unfamiliar hope began to bloom in the barren wasteland of his chest. He had shattered her world, yes. But maybe, just maybe, they could build a new one together. In the days that followed, something shifted. The fear was still there, a shadow in the corners of her eyes, but it no longer controlled her. He would find her reading in the library and she wouldn't immediately drop her gaze. He brought her a tray of honey cakes himself, a small, clumsy gesture, and she offered him a hesitant, trembling smile that hit him with the force of a physical blow. But as his own guard began to lower, another's gaze sharpened. He felt it in the throne room, Lord Vorlag's eyes on him. The beta's stare was no longer just suspicious. It was cold, analytical, and filled with a dawning, predatory understanding. Vorlag had been watching him, studying his every move, his every mood since the gathering, and he had seen the change. He knew. He might not know the word mate, but he knew the truth. The king had a weakness. The ruthless, untouchable Alpha King, who had built his reign on a foundation of iron and fear, had a single fragile point of vulnerability. And her name was Arya. That night in the torchlit cellar of a forgotten tavern, Vorlag met with the lords whose sons and brothers had fallen to accidents or been disgraced by the king. His rage is not for the pack, Vorlag said, his voice a low, venomous hiss. It is for the Omega. She is his obsession. She has made him weak, irrational. A grizzled old alpha, Lord Tyrell, slammed his fist on the table. My son is dead because of a servant girl. She is not a servant girl, Vorlag corrected, a cruel smile twisting his lips. She is his Achilles heel, and we are the arrow. The plan was forged in whispers and sealed with promises of power and revenge. They would not just remove the king. They would break him, and they would start with the one thing he cared about more than his crown, more than his life. The hunt, Aldrich realized as he felt the shift in the political winds of his court, was no longer his alone. The board had changed, and his queen was now the prize.
The word hung in the air of the library, a ghost and a promise. Mate. In the days that followed, the terror in Arya's heart didn't vanish. But it changed. It was no longer the fear of a caged animal, but the terrifying, breathtaking fear of standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing you must either learn to fly or fall. The king, Aldrich, was no longer just a monster. He was a mystery. And deep down, she knew the truth. Her life was no longer her own, because her soul had already recognized its other half. But that wasn't enough. He was killing for her, turning the court into a cauldron of fear, and all because of a bond she didn't understand. She had to know him. Not the crown, not the legend, not the fated mate. The man. Because if she was going to be the reason for a war, she needed to know if the man she was tied to was worth fighting for. So that night, she made a choice. She walked out of her gilded cage, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The two guards at the door to the Shadow Wing straightened, their hands instinctively going to the hilts of their swords. "You cannot pass," the first guard said, his voice a low baritone. It wasn't unkind, but it was absolute. Arya lifted her chin, channeling a strength she didn't know she possessed. Her wolf, a creature she was only just beginning to know, pressed forward inside her, lending her its courage. "He is my mate," she said, her voice trembling only slightly. "And I will speak with him. Stand aside." The guards exchanged an uncertain glance. They had orders, but they also had eyes. They saw the shift in her, the flicker of a future queen in the posture of a servant girl. Without another word, they parted, and she walked through. She found him in his private study, a place of dark wood, leather-bound books, and the sharp, masculine scent of him. He stood staring into a low fire, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, looking every bit the lonely king. He turned as she entered, his golden eyes widening in surprise. As the silence stretched, she realized this was it. Her one chance. Instead of talking about the murders or her fear or their bond, she asked the one question that cut through all of it. "The court whispers that you are nothing like your father," she began, her voice soft in the crackling quiet. "They say he was a kind man, a gentle alpha." She took a step closer. Was he a good king? His entire body went rigid. It was the last question in the world he had expected. Before he could speak, she took one more step, her empathy a tangible thing reaching across the space between them. "And what about your mother? Was she loved?" His carefully constructed world of iron and fury had just been pierced by two simple, devastating questions. For Aldrich, her words were a physical blow. No one had dared speak of his parents to him in a decade. They were a sealed room in his memory, a place of pain he never visited. And this small, brave girl had just walked right in and thrown open the shutters. His first instinct was to snarl, to throw her out, to reinforce the walls she had so effortlessly breached. But then he looked at her. Really looked at her. There was no political maneuvering in her eyes, no ambition. There was only a genuine, aching curiosity, a desire to know. Because she was his mate, she deserved the truth. And because she was brave enough to ask, he felt compelled to give it. "Sit," he commanded, his voice hoarse. He gestured to one of the heavy leather chairs by the fire, and to his surprise, she did. He remained standing, turning back to the flames. "My father," he began, the words feeling like rust and ash in his mouth. "My father was a good man. He loved my mother more than his own life. He was kind to his people and merciful to his enemies." He took a long swallow of his drink. "And that is why he is dead." Arya watched him, her heart aching for the cold, lonely boy she could see standing in the king's shadow. "I was 10 years old," Aldrich continued, his voice dropping to a low, haunted whisper. "We were in the Grand Hall, the same hall you were in. A lord from the Western Pax, a man my father had pardoned for treason, came to offer a gift of fealty." He paused, the memory sharp and cruel. "The gift was a dagger. He drove it into my father's heart while my father was embracing him. His guards killed my mother before my own could even react." He finally turned to face her, his golden eyes shimmering with a pain so profound it stole her breath. "I watched them die. I smelled the blood on the marble, and I learned the most important lesson of my life that day." "What lesson?" she whispered, her own eyes filling with tears for his loss. "That love is a weakness," he snarled, the words a culmination of a lifetime of pain. "Mercy is a poison. My father was a good man, and it got him and the woman he loved killed. I vowed that day I would be a strong king. I would be ruthless. I would be a monster no one would ever dare betray. Because a monster has no weaknesses." In that moment, she didn't see a monster. She saw a boy hiding behind a crown, terrified of his own heart. Her body moved on instinct. She stood up, walked to him, and did the one thing no one in his kingdom would have ever dared. She reached up and gently touched his face, her small warm hand against his rough, unshaven cheek. "You are wrong," she whispered. The touch was his undoing. A growl ripped from his chest, a sound of pure, primal agony and longing. He grabbed her, his hands tangling in her hair, and his mouth crashed down on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a desperate, hungry claiming. It was a decade of loneliness, of fury, of soul-crushing control finally breaking apart. But beneath the desperation, there was a deep, aching tenderness. He tasted of whiskey and sorrow and a desperate, burning need. Her arms went around his neck, pulling him closer, her own need rising to meet his. This was it, the final surrender. Her wolf howled in triumph. recognizing the broken pieces of its mate's soul and wanting only to make them whole. The air thickened, charged with a magic that was older than the castle walls. The space between them burned, and with every heartbeat their souls entwined. But then, crash! The great doors to the study were thrown open with such force they slammed against the stone walls. "There!" a voice roared, dripping with triumph. "There is the proof of our king's madness." Lord Vorlag stood in the doorway, his face a mask of righteous fury, flanked by a dozen other lords and their personal guards. They stared at the scene. The king, disheveled, his arms wrapped around a servant girl, a look of wild passion still on his face. Vorlag pointed a dramatic finger at Arya. He abandons his duties, he executes his most loyal warriors, and why? For her. For an Omega witch who has clearly ensnared him, he is not fit to rule. The private, sacred space had shattered. Their intimate confession had just become an act of high treason.
A murderous black rage surged through Aldrich. Growl. The sound that ripped from his chest was not human. It was the sound of a beast whose territory had been invaded, whose mate had been threatened. His first overwhelming instinct was to shift, to tear Vorlag's throat out with his teeth and slaughter every man who stood with him. He felt Arya tremble in his arms, her gasp of terror a sharp pain in his chest. And that was what saved them all. He looked down at her terrified face, and the cold, calculating king took back control from the raging wolf. Killing them now would be a release. It would be easy. But it would also prove Vorlag's point. It would validate the rebellion. No. He needed to do something worse. He needed to destroy their entire world. With a calmness that was more terrifying than any rage, he gently set Arya aside, never taking his eyes off Vorlag. He walked forward, his steps slow and deliberate, a predator approaching his cornered prey. The lords tensed, their hands on their weapons. "You have come into my private study," Aldrich began, his voice a low, deadly purr. "You have made accusations. You have threatened my guest. She is a curse upon this kingdom." Lord Tyrell spat, his face purple with rage over his dead son. Aldrich's eyes flickered to him. "No, she is the future." He stopped just before Vorlag, then turned his back on them all and walked to Arya's side. The entire room held its breath. He took her small, trembling hand in his, a silent promise passing between them. Then, he turned them both to face their accusers, pulling her from the shadows and into the full, harsh light. Her hand was a fragile bird in his, but he held it with an unshakable strength. What followed was not a denial. It was a declaration. It was the end of his old world and the dawn of a new one. "You see an obsession," he said, his voice ringing with an authority that shook the very stones of the castle. "I see my destiny." He took a step forward, pulling Arya with him. "You see a weakness," he continued, his golden eyes blazing. "I see my strength." He took one more step until they were standing directly before the stunned lords. "You see a servant," he finished, his voice dropping to a low, powerful growl that promised death and glory in equal measure. He then lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles without breaking eye contact with the traitor before him. "I see your queen." The moment the words, "I see your queen," left his lips, the world fractured. It did not happen with a roar, but with a laugh. A cold, sharp, and utterly triumphant laugh from Lord Vorlag. It was the sound of a trap snapping shut. "You hear him?" Vorlag bellowed, turning to the stunned lords, his voice ringing with false righteousness. "Madness. He forsakes our traditions. He forsakes his own pack for a nameless Omega. He sacrifices 1,000 years of law for a pretty face. Is this your king?" Before the echo faded, blades were drawn. Not against him. Not yet. They were drawn in defiance. The royal guard, his royal guard, moved like a wall of black iron, their own swords hissing from their scabbards to form a protective ring around him and Arya. "You have sealed your own fate, Vorlag," Aldrich growled, his voice a low promise of death. "No, Vorlag countered, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. You have. Without another word, he turned and strode from the study, the other lords following him like jackals behind a lion. They were not running. They were retreating to their battlements. The rebellion had begun. Arya, stay behind me, he commanded, his voice hard as stone. He pulled her with him, turning not to fight, but to a hidden panel behind a tapestry. A king always has an escape route. Garrus, the castle is on lockdown. Seal the gates. Get her to the queen's chambers, the most secure in the keep, and do not leave her side. But then, the sound began. A single deep tolling bell from the city's watchtower. 1, 2, 3 times. An alarm, a signal, treason. By the time they reached the heavily fortified queen's chambers, the sounds of fighting were already echoing from the outer courtyards. Moments later, a breathless scout fell to one knee before him, his face pale. Your Majesty, the outer garrisons, they have declared for Vorlag. They hold the city walls and the main gate. The castle is under siege. The trap wasn't just springing, it had been set for weeks. Every accident, every move he had made to protect Arya had been used by Vorlag as another stone in the foundation of this rebellion. Aldrich had been so focused on his personal, methodical revenge that he had missed the wider war being declared right under his nose. He had been playing checkers while Vorlag was playing chess. His entire kingdom was a cage, and he was trapped inside it with the one person he had been trying to protect. He looked at Arya, who stood pale and trembling by the hearth, and a cold, brutal fury washed through him. A fury at Vorlag, at the traitors, and at himself. Because of that, he had not only failed to protect her, he had just made her the primary target in a war for the crown.
The castle was a symphony of chaos. The distant clang of steel on steel, the faint, panicked shouts, the heavy thud of the portcullis dropping. It was the sound of her world ending. She was in the queen's chambers, a room of breathtaking beauty, with silks on the bed and silver on the tables. And she was a prisoner, more so now than ever before. Her gilded cage now had iron bars. Her thoughts spun. Aldrich was gone, swallowed by the War Council, leaving her with 2 stoic guards and the crushing, suffocating weight of her own guilt. I am a curse, the thought whispered, a venomous serpent in her mind. Every man who dies on those walls dies because of me. She paced the room, a frantic energy thrumming under her skin. She was useless, a prize to be won, a weakness to be exploited. Vorlag had called her a witch, and in that moment, she felt like one. Hadn't she brought this plague upon them all? To make things worse, the silence inside the room was a stark contrast to the violence outside. It felt wrong, unnatural. Her breath caught. It was too quiet. Her instincts surged. The guards were at the main door. The windows were 50 feet from the ground. But the sound, it hadn't come from there. It had been a soft, scraping noise, a whisper of stone on stone. Without warning, a section of the wall near the tapestry shifted. A dark, narrow opening appeared, a breath of cold, damp air slithering into the room. A figure emerged from the secret passage, dressed not in a guard's uniform, but in dark, supple leather. It was one of the men from the gathering. She recognized his cruel eyes. Rorik's brother. Her heart skipped. The Lord Vorlag sends his regards, the assassin hissed, a long, thin dagger gleaming in his hand. Her voice trembled. Guards! She screamed, her voice swallowed by the thick stone walls. Her body moved on instinct. She didn't cower. She grabbed a heavy silver water pitcher from a table and hurled it at him. He dodged it easily, the pitcher crashing against the wall with a deafening clang. She ran. She scrambled for the main doors, but he was too fast. He caught her by the hair, yanking her back with a grunt of effort. She fought. She kicked and clawed and bit, a feral desperation taking over. For a heartbeat, she broke free, but he lunged, tackling her to the floor. The air was knocked from her lungs. He raised the dagger. Her world tilted, narrowing to the point of that descending blade. Then, The main doors burst open. Crash! It was Garrus, Aldrich's commander, his face a mask of fury. The assassin hesitated for a fraction of a second, a fatal mistake. Garrus's sword was a blur of motion, a wet, sickening sound. The assassin fell, his dead eyes staring at the ceiling. But it was too late. A sharp, searing pain exploded in her side. She looked down. The assassin's dagger was still clutched in his hand, and a dark, wet stain was spreading rapidly across the pale silk of her dress. Her dress. Her blood. As Garrus knelt beside her, shouting her name, his voice seemed to come from a great distance. The last thing she heard before the darkness swarmed at the edges of her vision was a sound from far away in the castle. A sound of pure, unrestrained fury. It was Aldrich. And it was the most terrifying, heartbroken roar she had ever heard. When Aldrich burst through the doors, the scene that greeted him was his own personal hell. Garrus was kneeling on the floor. The body of a dead assassin lay beside him, and between them was Arya, pale, bleeding, her eyes fluttering closed. The scent of her blood hit him like a physical blow, short-circuiting his mind, his soul. He saw her lying there, and in a sickening flash of memory, he saw his father, lying on the white marble of the grand hall, the same look of stunned surprise on his face. He had failed. His entire life, his entire reign, every ruthless act, every cold word, had been dedicated to one single principle: to never be his father. To never be the man whose love was a weakness that got his mate killed. And here he was. He had found the other half of his soul, and his love for her, his obsession, his weakness, had led an assassin with a blade right to her side. He fell to his knees beside her, his hands hovering over her wound, terrified to touch her, terrified to hurt her more. A growl rose in his throat, a sound of such profound agony and self-loathing that it barely sounded real. "Get the healer!" he roared, his voice breaking. "Now!" In the quiet that followed, as Garrus scrambled to obey, Arya's eyes fluttered open. She looked at him, and what she saw in his face was not love. It was not concern. It was a shattered, horrified self-hatred. She saw the face of a man who was looking at his own greatest failure, and in that moment, her own core flaw, the deep-seated belief that she was a burden, a curse, crystallized into an undeniable truth. Vorlag was right. The lords were right. She was his weakness. Her very existence was tearing his kingdom, and the man she was fated to, apart. He would be better off without me. The thought came, cold and clear as a shard of ice in her heart. They all would. He saw the shift in her eyes, the flicker of resolve. As the healer rushed in, barking orders, he saw her pull away from him, not physically, but emotionally. She was building a wall, and he realized with a soul-crushing certainty that to protect her, he had to do the same. To keep her safe, he had to be the monster everyone thought he was. He had to be the cage, not the mate. He stood up, his face becoming a mask of cold, hard iron. "Garrus," he commanded, his voice utterly devoid of the emotion that was tearing him apart. "Once she is stable, double the guard. No one enters this room. No one leaves. Not even me." He turned and walked out, not looking back, the scent of her blood a brand on his soul. He locked the door from the outside, the heavy thud of the bolt echoing the sound of his own heart breaking. It was the same action he had taken weeks ago, but the meaning was a universe apart. Before, it had been a gilded cage to protect a treasure. Now, it was a cold stone prison to contain the source of his ruin. The bond between them, once a thing of fire and hope, was now just a shared, agonizing poison. And in the bleak, silent despair of their separate prisons, they both arrived at the same devastating conclusion. All was lost. The wound in her side was a dull, constant throb, but it was nothing compared to the agony in her soul. For 3 days, she had existed in the silent, opulent prison of the Queen's chambers, tended to by a silent, grim-faced healer. Aldrich did not come. The heavy bolt on the outside of her door was a constant reminder that he had locked her away, locked his weakness away. The thought was a bitter poison, and she deserved every drop. I am a curse, she thought, the words a familiar, painful rhythm against the beat of her own heart. A plague in a pretty dress. She was staring out the window at the smoke rising from some distant part of the city when Morwen, the stern attendant, entered with a tray of steaming broth. The old woman's face, usually a mask of rigid duty, was etched with a deep, weary sadness. "You must eat, my lady," Morwen said, her voice softer than Arya had ever heard it. "Why?" Arya's voice was a dead thing. "So I can be healthy when Lord Vorlag's men break down the door and put a real blade through my heart?" Morwen set the tray down with a firm thud. As the silence stretched, the old woman did something unexpected. She pulled up a small stool and sat, her tired eyes fixing on Arya's. "They are calling you the Omega Queen out there, you know," Morwen began, her voice a low, conspiratorial whisper. "The serving staff, the stable hands, the city folk who have only ever known the king's iron fist. They don't see a curse." Arya just stared, her mind too numb to process the words. "Do you know what they see?" Morwen leaned forward, her gaze intense. "They see a king who was once only a creature of shadow and fear, willing to risk his entire kingdom for something other than power. They see a king who might have a heart after all." She reached out, her wrinkled hand surprisingly strong as it closed over Arya's. "They see hope. They see you. And they hope that a kingdom ruled by a king with a heart might be a kinder place than one ruled by a tyrant alone." The words were a shock to her system, a splash of icy water on a slumbering soul. Hope? Her? No. She was a weakness, a liability. "But I am his weakness," Arya whispered, the belief so deeply ingrained it felt like bone. "He is losing this war because of me." "Is he?" Morwen countered, her voice sharp as a shard of glass. "Or is he losing because he is trying to fight a war of hearts and minds with only a sword? You are his mate, and Alpha is only as strong as his pack. And his pack is more than just the warriors in the courtyard. It is all of us." With that, Morwen stood, gave a stiff bow, and left the room. But her words remained, echoing in the silent chamber. A war of hearts and minds. Arya looked down at her own hands. She had no strength, no skill with a blade. What did she have? Empathy. The ability to feel, to understand the fears of the small, the overlooked, the powerless. She had always seen it as a vulnerability, the soft underbelly of an Omega. Maybe it was fate that she had been so wrong. In that moment, something inside her shifted. A tiny, defiant spark ignited in the cold ashes of her despair. Leaving him, sacrificing herself. That was the easy way out. That was the act of a coward, of the victim she had always been. Staying, fighting, using the one thing she was good at to save them. That was the act of a queen. Her world tilted. She stood up, the pain in her side a sharp reminder of what was at stake. She walked to the door, her steps weak but her resolve like iron. "Guards," she called out, her voice clear and strong, ringing with an authority she had never known she possessed. "Take me to the king, now."
The war room was a tomb. Stale air, the smell of old parchment, and the bitter stench of defeat. Aldrich stared at the massive map of the city, at the red markers indicating Vorlag's control, and felt nothing but a cold, hollow emptiness. He was moving his armies, issuing commands, fighting the war, but his heart, his wolf, his very soul was locked in that chamber with her. He was a body going through the motions, a king of ashes. "It's not working." The voice came from Garrus, his old commander who stood by the door, his arms crossed over his massive chest. "The eastern flank will hold," Aldrich replied without turning, his voice flat. "I'm not talking about the eastern flank, my king," Garrus said, his tone dangerously close to insubordination. "I'm talking about you. The men see it. They feel it. They are fighting for a ghost. Aldrich finally turned, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Watch your tongue, old man. Or what? Garrus shot back, taking a step forward. You'll banish me? Execute me? You're losing, Aldrich. You're losing because you're trying to be the monster you think you have to be, and you've forgotten how to be the leader they need. The accusation hit him harder than any blade. My father was the leader they needed, Aldrich snarled, the old pain a fresh gaping wound. And his love got him killed. I will not make the same mistake. No, you're making a new one. Garrus's voice boomed in the stone chamber. By the gods, boy, are you truly that blind? Your father's flaw wasn't that he loved your mother. His flaw was that he thought love was enough. He had a heart but refused to wield a sword. You have a sword but you're terrified to have a heart. A true alpha king, a true leader, needs both. The truth of the words slammed into him, a brutal, undeniable force. He had been swinging from one extreme to the other, the kind man who died, the ruthless monster who was failing. He had never once considered that the answer lay in the middle. The answer was not to be one or the other. It was to be both, to be whole. Between one breath and the next, the path forward became clear. He wasn't just fighting for his crown anymore. He wasn't just fighting to protect his mate. He was fighting for the chance to be the king his father never could be, and the man Arya deserved. As if summoned by the shift in his very soul, the heavy doors to the war room creaked open. And she was there.
Arya stood in the doorway, pale and leaning on the arm of a guard, a thick bandage visible beneath her dress. But her eyes were on fire. The fear was gone, replaced by a fierce, blazing resolve that he had never seen before. The air in the room crackled. The bond between them, which had been a source of shared agony, now pulsed with a new, tentative hope. He took a step towards her, his heart a painful, hammering drum in his chest. Arya. Her name hung in the air, a prayer. You are fighting the wrong war, she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through his apology before it could even form. She pushed off the guard's arm, taking a weak but determined step towards the map. He and Garrus exchanged a stunned look. She pointed a trembling finger at the red markers that infested the city map. You see an army, she said, her gaze sweeping over the board. But I see people. I see pack members who followed Vorlag not because they believe in him, but because they fear him. I see soldiers who are tired of a king who rules only with an iron fist, because they think that is all you are. Her eyes lifted to meet his, and the connection was so powerful it was like a physical touch. You cannot win their loyalty on the battlefield, Aldrich, she said, using his name for the first time, because Vorlag didn't win it there. He won it in the barracks, in the taverns, with promises and lies. You are fighting his soldiers. You need to fight his influence. A new strategy, a new possibility, a new hope bloomed in his mind, seeded by her words. He had been trying to crush a rebellion. She was telling him how to dismantle it. How? He whispered, his voice filled with a desperate awe. A slow, determined smile touched her lips. You show them the king you can be. Not the monster, not the kind man who died, but the alpha who has both a sword and a queen. In that moment, standing over the map of their besieged kingdom, they were no longer a king and his weakness, or a monster and his victim. They were a united front, an alpha and his Luna. He reached out, his hand gently taking hers, his thumb stroking over her knuckles, her fingers laced with his, a silent, binding promise. All right, he said, his voice a low, powerful rumble, the ghost of a smile touching his own lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. He turned to Garrus, his eyes blazing with a new, focused fire. Gather the loyal captains. We have a new battle plan. The war was not over. In fact, the final, most dangerous battle was yet to come. But as he stood there, his mate's hand in his, her brilliant mind working alongside his own. He was no longer fighting to avoid his father's fate. He was fighting to build their future.
The dawn broke gray and cold, smelling of rain and iron. The final battle for the capital, for the kingdom, for their future, had begun. Aldrich stood at the head of his loyalist army in the main courtyard, his black armor a stark contrast to the silver wolf crest that blazed on his chest. But this time he was not alone. Beside him, perched on a raised platform so all could see, was Arya. She wore no armor, only a simple dark blue dress, the color of a twilight sky. She looked fragile against the grim backdrop of war, yet her spine was straight, her chin was high, and a calm, unshakable resolve burned in her eyes. This was their plan. A war fought on two fronts, one of steel, one of soul. "For the king!" Garrus bellowed, and the loyalist roar was a thunderclap that shook the very stones. Aldrich drew his ancestral sword, its polished surface drinking the dim morning light. He met Arya's gaze one last time. "I love you," his eyes said. "Live," hers answered. With a final, earth-shattering war cry, he spurred his horse forward, leading the charge not towards the main gate, where Vorlag expected him, but towards the weaker western wall, a feint, a distraction. As the chaos of battle erupted, the clang of swords and the screams of men filling the air, Arya took a deep breath. Now it was her turn. She would not wield a sword. Her words were her weapon. From the city's watchtowers, Vorlag's archers took aim at the charging king. But before they could fire, another army moved. An army of whispers. Servants, stable hands, common folk, the people Morwen had spoken of, began spreading through the city streets carrying Arya's message, the one she and Aldrich had forged in the war room. They spoke of the king's mate, the Omega Queen who had been wounded by Vorlag's treachery. They spoke of pardons, of a new era, of a kingdom where strength was not measured by brutality alone. The archers hesitated. Their families were down there, in those streets. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, Aldrich was a whirlwind of controlled fury, a beautiful, deadly dance of death. He cut through the rebel lines, his golden eyes scanning, searching. And then he saw him. Lord Vorlag, astride a massive black warhorse, a cruel, jagged axe in his hand. Their eyes locked across the sea of fighting men. The world narrowed. This was it, the final reckoning. They charged at each other, a collision of destinies. Their weapons met with a scream of tortured metal that echoed across the field. "You should have stayed a monster," Vorlag snarled, his face contorted with hate as they wheeled their horses, trading blows. "This is what your weakness has earned you." "This isn't weakness," Aldrich grunted, parrying a vicious swing that would have taken his head off. "This is strength." At that very moment, from her platform, Arya saw it. A contingent of Vorlag's reserve soldiers, trapped between the king's army and the increasingly restless city, began to waver. This was her chance. Using a simple magical amplifier provided by a court mage, her voice, clear and resonant, rang out over the din of battle. "Soldiers of the pack," she called, and her voice, filled with an empathy they had never heard from a ruler, cut through their fear. "You follow a man who promised you glory, but he has only given you a traitor's death. He hid behind your courage while he sent assassins to murder an unarmed woman. Is that the alpha you will die for?" A ripple of uncertainty went through the rebel lines. They looked from the battle to their wavering commanders to the girl on the platform. Vorlag heard her. He faltered, his head turning for a fraction of a second towards the source of that voice, towards his power base crumbling. And in that fraction of a second, Aldrich saw his opening. With a roar that was both man and wolf, he surged forward, his sword a blur. It was over in a single, brutal, and decisive move. Vorlag's axe clattered to the ground, his eyes wide with shocked disbelief as he slid from his horse and fell into the mud. The king's justice delivered. As the silence roared in the space where their leader had just fallen, the rebel army looked up at the Omega Queen. And one by one, they knelt. The aftermath of a battle is not glorious, It is mud and blood and the heavy silence of grief. Aldrich stood over Vorlag's body, not with triumph, but with a grim, weary finality. His war was over. He turned to the kneeling rebels, his face a mask of stone. His wolf, his rage, demanded he slaughter them all for their treason. But Garrus's words and Arya's belief echoed in his mind. Both. You must be both. He found Lord Tyrell, Kaelin's father, his face a ruin of despair. My king, the old lord whispered, preparing for death. Your son was a traitor who attacked my mate, Aldrich said, his voice cold and hard, leaving no room for argument. And you followed him. For that, your lands and titles are forfeit to the crown. The sword. But your life is your own. You will live and serve the pack as a common soldier, and you will earn back your honor with loyalty, not with blood. The heart. He moved through the prisoners, dispensing his new justice. For the ringleaders, the ones who had stood with Vorlag in his study, there was only the swift, clean death of a traitor. The sword. For the common soldiers, the ones who had been swayed by lies and fear, there was a royal pardon. The heart. It was a new kind of rule. A balance of the man he was, and the man she had taught him he could be. As the last judgment was passed, he looked up at the platform. She was still there, waiting. Her presence was a silent, steady anchor in the storm of his past and the uncertainty of his future. Her instincts surged. He sheathed his bloody sword and began to walk towards her, leaving the battlefield and his ghosts behind. With every step he took, the weight of the crown seemed to lighten, replaced by a purpose that felt truer, cleaner. He was no longer just a king. He was her mate, and he was finally whole.
The blood moon ceremony was held a week later, not in the stuffy, formal throne room, but in the open-air grand courtyard, under the watchful eyes of the moon and the entire, now loyal pack. Arya stood on the dais, not in the gray of a servant, but in a gown of deep midnight blue embroidered with the silver wolf crest of the royal line. Aldrich stood before her, his own black tunic mirroring hers. He held no sword. Instead, he held 2 crowns. He spoke, his voice a low, powerful rumble that carried to every corner of the courtyard, a promise and a vow. I was a king of shadows, he began, his golden eyes fixed on hers, holding her, loving her. I ruled with fear because I believed love was a weakness. I was wrong. He turned to the assembled crowd. My mate, Arya, was wounded by the traitors. She was targeted because they believed she was my weakness. They, too, were wrong. He turned back to her. She is not my weakness, he declared, his voice ringing with a fierce, absolute pride. She is my heart. She is my wisdom. She is my queen. He took the smaller of the 2 crowns, a delicate, beautiful thing of silver wrought to look like intertwined branches of a willow tree, and gently, reverently, he placed it on her head. A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was not a mating ceremony. This was a coronation. The crown was cool and heavy on her brow, a weight of promise, not of burden. Her heart swelled with a love so profound it felt as if it might burst. The Omega servant, the girl who believed she was nothing, was now a queen. But Aldrich was not finished. In front of his court, his warriors and his people, the most powerful, feared alpha king in a generation, knelt. He went down on one knee before her, bowing his head in an act of ultimate submission and devotion. My life, my love, my loyalty are yours, Arya, he murmured, his voice for her alone. My queen. She reached down, her hand trembling as she cupped his cheek, a single happy tear tracing a path down her face. And mine are yours, Aldrich, she whispered back. My king. As he rose, he took her hand, and they turned to face their people, their hands clasped, their crowns gleaming under the light of the blood moon. They were not 2 separate rulers, but 2 halves of a whole, a sword and a heart, a king and a queen. And as the pack erupted in a single, unified, joyous howl that shook the very stars, they stood together, looking out at the new, brighter future they had bled for, fought for, and won. Together.